spring of 1945, as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, military intelligence officers reviewing captured Wehrmacht radio traffic began to notice something unusual. German unit commanders were circulating warnings that had not appeared earlier in the war. The messages advised caution when encountering American troops displaying traditional signals of capitulation. These warnings reflected not a breakdown in surrender procedures, but a growing uncertainty about whether long-established assumptions still held. This video is presented for historical and educational purposes only. Uncertainty did not emerge from changes in official policy or command directives. Instead, it reflected pressures building at the lowest levels of combat. Conditions where established frameworks struggled to account for the realities faced by isolated infantry units operating under extreme constraint. The conventional understanding of surrender during mid-20th century warfare relied on mutual recognition. When continued resistance was no longer viable, international law provided a structured mechanism. Visible signals, a pause in hostile action, and subsequent treatment governed by agreed conventions. This system functioned only because both sides trusted that the signals being used carried consistent meaning. Like all systems built on shared expectations, it contained vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities became more visible as the war approached its conclusion. By early 1945, American infantry units advancing through Western Germany encountered increasingly complex defensive environments. German positions were frequently concealed, reinforced, and designed to limit visibility and maneuver. Even as the Wehrmacht retreated, many units retained experienced personnel capable of imposing severe operational disruption on advancing forces. For small American units operating at the edge of larger formations, encounters could unfold rapidly and with little margin for adjustment. Standard responses: withdrawal, suppression, or coordination with supporting elements, assumed favorable terrain and sufficient time in forested regions, damaged infrastructure, and fragmented front lines. Those assumptions often failed. Field reports reflected growing concern over these encounters. Units caught in unfavorable situations faced outcomes ranging from forced withdrawal to loss of operational cohesion. The unpredictability of treatment after capture further complicated decision-making, particularly when engagements occurred far from established command oversight. Within this environment, some soldiers began to recognize a pattern in enemy response procedures. When surrender indicators appeared, German forces typically transitioned from active engagement to a verification process. Attention shifted from immediate coordination to compliance assessment, following established training protocols. What mattered was not the specific actions taken during these moments, but the existence of a procedural pause itself. The transition from combat to control created a narrow interval of uncertainty, one governed by expectation rather than immediate threat assessment. This observation did not originate from formal planning or doctrinal instruction. It emerged from repeated exposure to the same sequence of responses under pressure. In rare cases, individuals attempted to exploit that procedural gap, treating it not as the end of engagement, but as a moment of disorientation within the system. These actions stood in direct violation of international law. The Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited perfidy, the misuse of protected status to gain military advantage. False signals of surrender were included precisely because they threatened the reliability of the entire surrender framework. If trust in those signals collapsed, genuine capitulation would become impossible. Military leadership recognized the danger immediately. If opposing forces concluded that surrender indicators could not be relied upon, The consequences would extend far beyond isolated incidents. Thousands of soldiers, genuinely attempting to disengage from combat, could be placed at severe risk. General orders were issued reaffirming the prohibition. Commanders were instructed that misuse of surrender signals constituted a serious violation. The language was unambiguous, emphasizing both legal responsibility and the broader systemic consequences of eroding established conventions. In practice, enforcement proved inconsistent. Frontline conditions rarely allowed for detailed investigation, and many incidents went unrecorded or were documented without clarity regarding sequence or intent. The gap between formal policy and battlefield reality remained unresolved. After the war, military institutions undertook systematic analysis of combat performance. These studies focused not on individual actions, but on identifying recurring patterns in how engagements unfolded under pressure. Analysts examined how procedural expectations shaped behavior and how transitions between states, from engagement to control, created moments of vulnerability. The challenge was how to address these findings without undermining the legal frameworks that governed armed conflict. The solution appeared in post-war doctrine through careful abstraction. Infantry manuals expanded their treatment of battlefield deception, misdirection, and the exploitation of predictable response patterns. Rather than referencing prohibited actions directly, the material emphasized understanding enemy procedures and managing transitions between phases of engagement. The prohibition itself remained firmly stated. Violations of international law were clearly identified as unacceptable. At the same time, officers were trained to recognize how procedural rigidity could influence outcomes, both in their own units and in opposing forces. By the time of the Korean conflict, this dual approach had become institutionalized. Training programs required students to analyze scenarios where individuals faced extreme constraints and limited options. The historical examples used were deliberately generalized, focusing on decision-making under pressure rather than specific actions taken during the Second World War. This pattern reveals something important about how military organizations evolve. Formal rules establish essential boundaries, but experience exposes where those boundaries strain under operational reality. Institutions rarely resolve this tension directly. Instead, they manage it through language, classification, and selective emphasis. Public doctrine maintains clarity and prohibition. Internal education preserves awareness of how systems behave under stress. The individuals who first encountered these dilemmas rarely appear in official histories. Most returned home without recognition or sanction, their experiences absorbed indirectly into institutional knowledge. The opposing forces who observed similar behaviors conducted their own analyses, reaching comparable conclusions about procedural vulnerability without moral commentary. The broader significance lies not in the specific actions taken, but in what they reveal about systems built on trust. When conditions deteriorate, individuals adapt. Some adaptations prove effective enough to influence doctrine even when they remain officially forbidden. This contradiction persists because it reflects an unresolved reality of organized conflict. Legal frameworks are necessary, but they are tested at the margins, where structure gives way to immediacy. The resulting adaptations are neither celebrated nor erased. They are managed. The legacy of these events does not appear in formal commendations or commemorations. It exists instead in training language that cautions while instructing, prohibits while analyzing. That quiet contradiction captures something essential about how warfare actually evolves, not as a sequence of clean decisions, but as an accumulation of pressures, responses, and imperfect solutions.